Welcome to another episode of the Run to Daylight podcast. I'm your host, Todd Burrows, and today I'm joined by Justin Herzig of Establish the Run. He is a returning hero. We had a very, very good, deep Bestball strategy discussion this year, and I'm hoping that we can live up to that hype this year and give you guys some deeper thoughts on how to attack Underdog. And speaking of Underdog, this episode is brought to you by my friends over at Underdog. Always be drafting. I know Justin doesn't agree with that. He's definitely more of a wait till August drafter in general. But I like keeping my hand in the till pretty much from February right on through the season. You can go to Underdog Fantasy, sign up for a Bestball Mania, use the code Bestball, and they will match your first $100. Always be drafting Underdog Fantasy, and that's mostly what Justin and I are going to be talking this year today. Justin, welcome back to the show, and thank you again for doing it.
I appreciate that. And I will say, I just did a little quick count on Underdog. I'm over 500 drafts in on the summer. So I am drafting. Wow.
Just I just haven't seen you in the rooms.
Well, because it depends on which room you're looking at. Because a lot of those I was focusing on, like the ones that were, we're going to close early on. So you have the big board, the rookie sophomores, the backyard, the big board plus super flex. And then, Bestball Mania 3, I'm at 60 right now. So
you're ahead of me. All right, I take it back. I've got let's see. I really did want to save a lot of them for the end, but I wanted to have different. I wanted to have different ones throughout. So Bestball Mania, I'm at 43. So not too different from what you've done. Getting ready for the big push down the stretch. Famously, you won a couple years ago. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about you're doing more streaming this year than you've done in the past. I think you said bi-weekly. What is the focus of those podcasts, and what can people expect when they tune in?
Yeah, so those live streams twice a week, Tuesday, Thursday, always bringing on someone from the industry. And they're on the Establish the Run channel, free for anyone. Come join us on those 2 days. And the goal really is I don't consider myself like a talker. I don't consider myself like I'm just going to go on a pod and give out strategy and stuff. But, I think what's been most valuable for people is just seeing how my practice actually doing the drafts live. And it's more comfortable for me because then, hey, I'm already doing these drafts. And then the best part is it allows me to bring on some really smart people from the industry, and not just people who are Bestball drafters, but people who have different skills, different talents in the industry. So, for example, had a chance to bring on Pat Corain and Ben Gretsch, who really know the football side of things, especially some of the younger guys, on the college. So that gives a good perspective around how we should be drafting there. We had TJ Hernandez from 4 for 4 on earlier this week, and getting his perspective on
TJ's fabulous.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
And I like guys like TJ who have a real good background in DFS, because there are a lot of things that I've brought over that I brought from Bestball to DFS that helped me win pretty good one year, and vice versa. I've now, over the last year or two, with these big tournaments, brought a lot of the theory that I learned in DFS over to Bestball.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. And like with TJ, he takes a lot of that kind of knowledge from the DFS side of things, from the game theory aspects, from lineup construction. That's not just the, traditional Bestball strategy, but from that more well-rounded perspective. And so I've been able to learn a lot through these drafts. And I hope that, the audience, the people that are kind of joining us in stream, in the lobbies, have some fun and chat, enjoy it from entertainment perspective, and maybe just each draft they can pick up one thing that they can start using in their portfolio.
2 years ago, you famously took down Bestball 1 with a 4 running back build. Can you please remind everyone what exactly was the big picture strategy with that? Because I see a lot of people doing 4 running backs, not this year. It's backed off this year because you won 2 years ago. People are doing what won last year now. But, could you just reiterate your thoughts? Because I found a lot of people thinking they were doing your strategy where they had 4 running backs with one in the 13th round and one in the 18th. That really isn't your strategy, correct?
Right. And so, I mean, I wouldn't even really call it like, hey, this is my strategy. But for that year, that's what I felt was the right move. And if you look at the next year, when we had our conversation, it's when I started talking about like I actually adjusted to a 5 RB strategy and can talk on why that happened. But so 2 years ago, started realizing that there was this hyper fragile structure. There was value to saying like, hey, I want to draft like I'm right. And so really focusing on those first 3 rounds, likely leaving those 3 rounds with 2 strong RBs, and then grabbing another 2 that are complementary pieces. And I would say anywhere between the 5th to 9th rounds or something. And when we actually are drafting that, that hyper fragile, that 4 RB, it's not just, okay, let me just take 4 RBs and hope that, well, my first 2 are going to do so well. So it's okay if my 4th one is going to be, Kenneth Gainwell, or if my 4th one's going to be Alexander Madison.
Depends on how strong the 3 are, right?
And it depends on how strong they are and what you're trying to do. Because for me personally, if I have a 4 RB build, Alexander Madison's never going to fit into that for me, because the way that he wins you leagues is, well, it obviously starts with an injury with Dalvin Cook. And if Dalvin doesn't get injured, yeah, maybe there's a little opportunity because the coaching changes stuff. But in general, Madison's getting 0 points or is not, really contributing. That's not as important to me as someone who can just provide me with that 12 to 15 steady points for the occasional off weeks, whether it's buys, whether it's the 1 injury or 2, whether it's just the bad weeks from those initial 2-3 starters. And so I'm really
need enough to get you to the playoffs, to where your fragility can get you to the top.
Exactly. And so that's where I believe on that lineup back that year, like Tony Pollard, I think was my 4th one. David Montgomery might have been my 3rd one. And then I had my kind of top 2. And so for that lineup, like I was like, okay, I like Pollard as my 4th running back because he's someone who can deliver me weekly value because he's still playing, he's still getting touches, but also has that upside where, and I think it was one of the early weeks of the playoffs, Zeke didn't play. Pollard put a 20-plus game up. And so that was that mixing. If we fast forward to the next year, that's when so many people similarly started taking that 4 RB structure. And what's that mean? Well, that meant that if they were going 4 RBs, there were a lot of RBs that were really falling deep into drafts. And so the RBs that historically, based off their kind of prospect profile, the way that they are in the offense, we would see them go in like the 10th round or falling to the 13th or so. And so that's when I adjusted to last year. I took a lot of RB starts and then waited a bit and grabbed 3 running backs in that 10th to 14th round, because that's where I felt that was the kind of best use of the value of the draft capital. And so it's not so much like, hey, I love a 4 RB build. That worked for that time based off how others are drafting. Last year for me, it was the 5 RB build. And this year, we're still getting that feel for what it's going to be.
Yeah, and I think because this year, more than any other year, the whole dead zone running back thing has kind of gone mainstream. And you are seeing value at running back really throughout the first 15 rounds of most drafts, to me. And that opens up both 0 running back, hero running back, and fragile 4 running back, because you can piece together 4 really good backs. Like I've done 1 or 2 where, Ronald Jones was my 4th. It was before McKinnon signed, but I had 3 really good ones. And I feel like Ronald Jones is going to have a role. And, but even a guy like Jamal Williams, if I have 3 really good ones, a guy like that who's last week he put up 4 10-point weeks and he was hurt, right? I don't see his role changing. That's not a bad 4th guy, correct?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it depends how strong those first 3 are. Correct. Because, but Jamal Williams, he has that weekly value where he can still deliver you those 10, 12 or so points. And then we saw when DeAndre Swift was hurt, he was getting 19 touches. And no, he didn't convert those 19 touches into too many points because Detroit was also very bad.
Hurt. He was also still playing hurt.
Exactly. And if we think Detroit's going to be better this year, which I think they will,
I do too.
I think I think he's a decent pick. But for me, it's less on the player profile and more on just that larger fit. And so here, when I think of running backs, I think of 3 core elements. I think of the talent of the player. I think of we'll call it efficiency or the talent of the team. And I think of the volume that he's getting.
The opportunity, I like to call it. right?
So for opportunity, which one would you book? Would you stat for volume?
Well, I think opportunity is the current volume that he's
Okay.
expecting,
Agreed.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
And
So
then
we'll go.
and that to me is his floor. And then I'm looking to see. I like drafting running backs who have who's after the first few rounds where you want opportunity and upside. After that, you want opportunity where and they have upside should an injury happen to the guy who's in front of them. Perfect example, AJ Dillon, right? AJ Dillon this year has a really good floor, and at times he falls to where I think he's a really good value if nothing happens to Aaron Jones, but we all know that Aaron Jones does. So I like the ADP and the current opportunity to make sense. And then I like having what I call my gravy, where if there is an injury, you're getting the gravy on top.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And where I was going is for that dead zone that you talked about. I mean, historically, so when I think of those three main buckets, I think of the talent of the player, I think of the talent of the team from an offense, and I think of the opportunity, the volume for it. Historically, the dead zone are players that lacked one or two of the talent for the individual or talent of the team, but just had a steady role. And so David Montgomery is a great example where not that great of a player. The offense isn't that great, but we knew he was going to get that steady volume. And so that's
because it's opportunity cost is what used to drive those guys up.
Right. And
right?
so,
maybe I'm not saying that right. In other words, people needed running backs so they would reach past where the real value of the player was, hence the dead zone.
Right. And those were the players that really filled up that dead zone. I feel like this year is actually substantially different. If you look at Ezekiel Elliott, you may argue that he doesn't have the talent himself. I think it's a fair argument at this point in his career, but he definitely has the volume and he definitely has the team upside. That doesn't mean I'm drafting a lot of Zeke, but he's not our traditional dead zone. I think in a year or two ago, that would be like a late third round pick, but this year it looks like it's more like maybe a fifth. And if you take a look at the different dead zones in that kind of our historical 4th to 6th round running backs, like Bryce Hall's another example where he has amazing talent. The offense is a question mark, but there's line of sight to that being a lot better. And he's just not getting that volume early on. But he's getting drafted at 44? And then Cam Akers, very similar situation, has the talent, has an amazing offense, but maybe doesn't have the volume. And so now our dead zone has flipped a bit where there's a lot of players who are on great teams and or have great talent, but we're just not sure of their role. And those are actually people that I don't mind making bets on. Of course, you got to look at the opportunity cost for who you're giving up at that time as well.
Yeah, and because wide receivers are getting pushed up throughout the whole draft, and there's value at running back throughout the whole draft, like you said, just because Zeke is a good choice doesn't mean you need to have 15% of them, right? I've been taking a lot of Zeke in the last week, and I hadn't had a lot of them, but I've been taking a lot in the last week where I start wide receiver pits. Right. And then 4th round, end of the 4th round, Zeke's there. To me, that he's a great, or Akers. I think both of them are excellent choices there. And a lot of guys who would have been dead zone running backs in the past, like Rashad Penny, Singletary, guys who should have a Gibson, guys who should have a really decent role, but miss some of what the other things that you mentioned. Those guys aren't going in the 4th to 6th round. They're going in the 7th to 10th round.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm still not drafting Gibson or Jacobs. But I'm not blaming you if you are, as long as it's fine a part of your roster construction, because as you mentioned, those guys are getting drafted a lot later than what they were in the past. I still think that from a purely projection standpoint is about where they're getting drafted. And that makes sense. They, in my mind, lack the upside that I'm looking for when I'm trying to win this style of contest, because they have both shown us, their offenses have shown us that they don't have the role to become an RB1. And that's really what I'm looking for is I want the 25 to 30 plus opportunity rather than the 15 to 20 point games that those two will often give us.
Yeah, Jacobs, I completely agree. I disagree on Gibson because I think the talent is there. And, last year McKissick went down and all of a sudden then he was he was putting up very close to what you would want. And he played on a bad wheel all year, right? Brian Robinson is there now. He's an upgrade on Patterson. But I don't want to fight over individual guys, but I get your larger point. The other thing that you pointed to that I really want to touch on here is the fact that I see a lot of really smart guys who do a lot of great research into what was optimal last year, try and build their strategy around what was optimal last year, where both you and we look at what was successful last year as kind of a starting point, but then we say, okay, well, how's the board changed, right? Last year's information is only as good as what was inputted into it. And as the board changes, how important do you think that is? And I think that's one of those real big edges that you can have on the field if you don't look at last year and say, well, this is how to attack this year.
Right. No, I think that's a very sharp point. And one example I think that helps, I think portray this is the data last year shows that if you drafted 4 tight ends, you had a very high win rate, like a very, very good win rate. And so level one is, 4 tight ends had a great win rate last year. I'm going to draft 4 tight ends this year. Okay, well, that's one strategy. That's probably not it. We should actually look a little deeper into, okay, why did they? Like, was it the 4th tight end that you're drafting? Is that what did it? Well, if we look a little more in the data, it shows that, well, people who drafted 4 tight ends, they did it near the end of drafts, because why else would you draft 4 unless, you need it for your last 4 picks? So then we look, okay, which tight ends were getting drafted in those last 4 rounds? And the reason why these had such high success rates is because Dalton Schultz, Dawson Knox, and Rob Gronkowski were all drafted in those last 4 rounds and had fantastic seasons. And so now it's okay. Well, it's not so much that they drafted 4, it's that they drafted a larger amount, which gave them a better chance at hitting on one of those 3 guys. But now let's think, okay, when we want to draft those similar tight ends, what are we looking for? And the commonality of those 3 tight ends, Dallas, Buffalo, and Tampa, 3 of the highest powered passing offenses last year. And so that makes me want to say this year, like, hey, am I going to draft 4 tight ends? Probably not. I've done it once or twice. But what I am going to do is when I'm drafting tight ends late, I'm looking for tight ends on offenses I think can be high-powered passing offenses. And one example there is Hayden Hurst on Cincinnati, high-powered passing offense. No, I don't love Hayden Hurst as a player. No, he's not like someone you expect to have this huge breakout. But he fits that bill of maybe something happens with the scheme. Maybe, they're taking advantage of because Higgins and Chase and Boyd are going to distract that. He ends up with a 12 touchdown season. And those are the opportunities that you can get substantial value. And it all comes back to, well, we learned this from that 4 tight end sample, but it's not the 4 tight ends that was a takeaway. It's draft the tight ends on the high powered passing offenses that are late in drafts.
I absolutely love that. I've learned something today that I didn't know before we talked. I think that is a tremendous point. And I would say O.J. Howard is a guy that you could stick in at the end. If Knox goes down, we all know O.J. Howard was a high draft pick with a lot of talent. Last year was his first off a major injury. I think you could do worse than throwing a flyer out on him. Even if you've got 2 tight ends that you like, if you like your 8 wide receivers, rather than taking that 9th guy who's a complete dart, he's a dart that might make sense. The other point I want to make is, if you drafted 2 tight ends and one of them was Dalton Schultz, you probably had a pretty good win rate with that, right? You just didn't. All right. So we've talked about there that we talked about how last year when we talked, I said, I remember the exact question. I said, are you concerned that so many more people are doing your 4 running back builds, making it far less unique, making it much less likely to be unique and accomplish what you were trying to accomplish with that strategy. The board has changed a lot this year, with hero running back being, what was very successful last year. Is there an edge this year, do you think, in a basic roster construction where you just say, I'm going to be fragile with this position? Do you think that the board is offering something this year?
I think it's interesting. So if we're looking for a specific position based, I wouldn't say like, oh, there's just tremendous value here or there. I do really like the late tight ends in this. So from a tight end positional factor, what I've been doing is grabbing either an elite one or trying to grab one of, or try to go 3 pretty late. So I'd say that's my overall tight end strategy. For the other positions, I think it's all about just kind of pockets of where you like those players, where you like the talent. Like, I think there's some substantial wide receivers that are getting drafted in the 18th to 20th rounds, depending on your structure, that have a very wide range of outcomes, likely because they're either rookies, they're in new situations, the team has new coaching situations. And so those are really what I'm trying to hammer down on, is where are the widest range of outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's grant me 1 or 2 late tight ends that you like besides Hurst.
All right, late tight ends. So Tyler Higbee's probably one that I have the most of from a late perspective. And a lot of that just fits the mold of, I think there's a positive regression candidate. He was one of the highest targeted tight ends in the red zone last year. Just wasn't able to convert them. I think from the eye test that he had a few of them that actually got tackled like at that one. And then also, this is a player who has a very secure role. We've seen times where McVay uses, I'd say, opponent strategies where they'll kind of pick up and say, hey, I'm going to focus directly on you. It's why why Tyler Higbee had that stretch a couple of years back of the 6 or 8 games where he just went off. And overall, Rams are a very high-powered offense. And so he's one where I think there's just the difference between him and Dalton Schultz is not that much, but they're getting drafted around 10 rounds different.
You could argue that Higbee was more likely to break out than Schultz was.
Yeah, no, I think it's very fair. And so don't quote me on this, but I believe the difference in targets between Dalton Schultz and Tyler Higbee last year was less than 1 per game. And it just worked out that Dalton Schultz had a lot. And maybe there's some, maybe you're feeling that, hey, the Dalton Schultz has upgrades because Amari Cooper left, because Gallup has this slight, injury issue. Sure, there's arguments, but for me, I see the upside of Higbee at where he's getting drafted at ADP of 165 or so.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you about this player because he goes right next to Higbee. And I have been adding him because he also is a good correlation with the Jets, kind of a secondary correlation. Whether or not you have the team, you could pick up Corey Davis late and Fant late and have a nice, interesting mini correlation week 17. Thoughts on Fant?
Yeah, I'm just looking at my correlate. So, I've got a decent amount of him. It's 15%. So, pretty much 2x. But that said, I have a lot of him because of the way that I'm drafting, and I have a lot of those late tight ends. I do like Higbee more, but yes, those two go back to back. And a lot of, as you mentioned, I've got a decent amount of jet stacks, so Fant becomes a decent partner there. The thing is, I don't love the pick because that offense is going to be so bad, and it's hard for a tight end to break out on an offense that is so bad. And
I knew you were going to say that,
right?
And you hope that the talent that he's flashed can overcome that.
You hope. And I think what it means is that Higbee has a higher upside because of the entire offense than Fant. But at where Fant's getting drafted, where he fits my builds, where he fits the kind of as a run back of the Jets, I'm still taking him. But I wouldn't say he's a player that I'm trying to target.
It brings up a bigger point of differentiation. I see on Twitter some wild strategies. And when you question them, you always get the comment, well, you have to be different to win a tourney like this. which of course is true. But do you still believe there's enough of an edge doing the basics of roster construction, advanced roster construction, good exposure strategy, double stacking quarterbacks, and having week 16 and 17 correlations? Or, do you feel that these people who come up with these unique builds, I think I asked it the way I wanted it already.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's one or the other. I think, like, I've seen over the past couple of days, and some people that I consider friends in the industry have been posting that they're only taking one quarterback because no one else is. One of the joking is like, no one else is doing this is unique. Well, I mean, yeah, it is unique, but there's a lot of data that shows that like one quarterback just isn't successful, and you're going to make the argument that like, okay, well, there's been only 2 or 3 seasons of data, so it's really not that large. That's very fair in certain data studies, we could call them. But when we actually see like, hey, we've got a wide range of QBs that were drafted late that actually broke out. We've got QBs that were drafted middle that were the number 1 QB for the year. And like, even when that happens and you have that amazing season, like it still shows it was still better to have a second QB, giving up 20, 25 points in the season for that one bye week when you could draft Carson Wentz with the 17th, 18th round pick. Chances are you're getting Carson Wentz's points for that whatever bye week your elite guy is in. And then you're probably still going to use Carson Wentz maybe 1, 2, 3 times throughout the year.
It comes out about 3. I've done some research. It's 2 to 3 times a week besides the bye where, even if it's only 5 points, right? Carson Wentz gives you 22 on a week when Mahomes has 17. You do get 2 to 3 of those out of 16, 17 games.
Yeah. So say right there, maybe it's 30 to 40 points on the season. The chance of you picking up 30 to 40 points from a round 17, round 18 player is very low. Now, yes, you may have the opportunity to actually pick up the Amon-Ra St. Brown with your 17th and 18th. And so that does need to be calculated. But from a purely advanced rate and from like, I think a larger EV standpoint, there are still rules or still things that I'm going to follow and not get too crazy. Where I'm trying to get unique are in areas that I'm not giving up substantial value. And so one of those examples is the handcuff conversation that we've been having this year. And first in the early days, had a conversation with Leone, one of my partners at ETR. And he was like, this is really interesting. I want to dig more into it from a data perspective. And so my initial theory was that there's actually value to be drafting handcuffs this year because of that, it's making a bet on the team. I don't think it actually hurts you that much throughout the season, but most importantly, it's a good way to get unique in week 17 because you may get some ping pong aspects where an injury here or there, and maybe in weeks, Madison and Cook is an example where in week 16 you needed Madison, but then in week 17 Cook is back healthy, and how many teams have them both? And so what Leone did is he took a look at first off, like, well, how much value are we actually giving up to get this potential uniqueness? And his data showed that drafting 2 running backs from the same team, if you're doing it correctly, isn't actually that bad of a decision. And then he isolated when is the best time to do it. And those examples were when there was lack of clarity in who the actual, workhorse was, when it was more of a 1A, 1B situation. And
can I give you an example of how I did it last year? This is something I wrote articles on 5-6 years ago. And by the way, back to the 1 QB thing, there is actually 8 years of data. If you consider MFL 10s, we have win rates going back pretty far that show 1 quarterback is substandard. So, I call it stack cuffing. It's not traditional handcuffing. And what I look for to stack cuff is I want 2 guys who have a good floor at their ADP. But if one gets hurt, if I said to you last year, would you trade your 6th and 9th round pick for a 2nd round quality running back? Would you sign up for that?
I don't know. I'm not sure, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, but so what I last year the one stack cuff I had was Edmonds and Connor, right? But there was that exact thing that you didn't know the role. A few years ago, famously, I did it with Hunt and Ware, and then Ware got hurt and Kareem Hunt went nuts, right? So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for where both guys can pay off at their ADP, but if you get the injury, the other guy can crush.
Right. And I think what's important in that situation, again, is doing this in offenses where you feel that there is, substantial
Exactly.
upside. And so, like, if you take a look at this year, like, if you are bullish on the Miami offense, you believe that, hey, new coaching staff wants to be a run-first team like they were in San Francisco, then maybe Edmonds and Raheem Mostert is a good combo because they can both surpass their ADP and they also can have kind of ping-pong success rates.
The one time I won't do it is, Miami doesn't interest me because there's a third guy. I don't like there to be a third guy because what if the answer, you have two, and then the answer is Sony Michel.
But
right?
That's why Mostert's getting drafted in the 18th.
That's
because
fair.
Of that third guy.
It's fair. But I was much more I was doing it a little bit with Damian Harris and Ramondre in early drafting before they took Pierre Strong. I don't like there to be a solid third option that can jump. And again, my theory sounds slightly different than the one you and Leone came up with.
Right.
You guys are doing something a little bit different.
Right. And I think what you're saying makes complete sense. I think we overestimate the potential risk of players like, we don't know, obviously, between CH, Rojo, and McKinnon. And last year, we didn't really know between Rojo, Leonard Fournette, and Giovanni Bernard. And a lot of the reason why people weren't drafting Leonard Fournette is because, well, Gio's going to get that pass down role and Rojo's going to cut into some. So, why would you? Well, no, we were just wrong. And instead, we should have just been betting on that offense is going to be highly productive and someone is going to break out there. And so that's where this year I'm trying to say, hey, that Miami run game, I think is going to be really strong. You're right. It might be Sony Michel. It might be Raheem Mostert. Rather than fading it all, I'll just maybe mix up a little between my Mostert and my Michel as the number 2 to Chase Edmonds.
Yeah. Or you could just, another thing is you could just, in a 3-way, just take them, but Mostert or Michel late without Edmonds, right? There's nothing wrong with that either. And again, it comes back to something that I learned today that I feel that I need to be better at. I do focus on good offenses more than I have, but you really lock in on it, right? And I think that is a very, very smart way of finding these situations, because it's the old DFS thing of, well, how much do you win when you win? And even if you're on one of the worst, like Fant, like you said, yeah, you might get one game with 25 points where he catches 2 long ones, but on a week-to-week basis, he's going to be tough to get you points.
I think here's an example: is Christian Kirk is getting drafted around pick 84. From a projections, a lot of things really like Christian Kirk. I think he could definitely be a value at where he's being drafted. But if I'm going to be drafting Christian Kirk, I'm only doing it because I believe that Jacksonville offense can literally be a top 10 passing offense with, Lawrence and the new coaching staff. I'm not sure if I believe that. I'm still trying to figure that out. But I
feel a lot better about the Giants. If you want to look at that, if you 100%. Want to look at that kind of thing, I have a lot of Tony and a lot of Galladay.
100% agree. Daniel Jones is probably my highest owned quarterback. I believe that offense can be very good with Dable and everything there. And again, for me, I know that I'm not going to always be right around, hey, what teams, what players. But when I'm at least making that selection, I'm at least doing it with the mindset of, okay, here's why I'm doing it. And so there are some teams that I'm just the Christian Kirk type role where he's probably going to be the alpha in that offense. But if you don't have faith in that offense, even if he does surpass value and he, ends up with 8 catches each week, but, it's just not that much to the team isn't that great. Him going and being a 6th round value and you drafted him to 8th, that's not going to win you leagues. That's not what we're looking for.
I'd rather take a shot on Marvin Jones, and that's kind of how I've played that situation.
Okay, and Marvin Jones obviously getting drafted later, but I'm talking about at the directly where Christian Kirk is. I'd rather go DeAndre Hopkins. I'd rather go Michael Thomas.
100%.
I'd rather go.
Right. I have a ton of Michael Thomas because if I'm right, one of my sayings is, I rarely have more than 20% of anybody, and most of my ownerships are in the teens. So if I have 15 to 17% Michael Thomas, what you don't realize is my leverage is those other 85% of the teams that don't have him. But what I'm trying to do is put enough pieces together of guys who can crush their ADP that I get enough teams through, and those teams have the potential to take it all the way.
Yeah, no, completely agree.
When it comes to roster construction, I find most information is very basic. I like 2 quarterbacks. Some people like 3. I like 4 running backs. Some people like 5, or I like 0 running back. One thing I do is I kind of, in my brain, establish a weight per position. And it's how much draft capital, how much floor, and how much upside and how much risk each position, each player group has within each individual draft. So do you think similarly to that? I just find that it's much more important to balance out your risk and your upside in these position groups.
Yeah, I'd say across my entire portfolio, I try to keep it fairly balanced. And a lot of it for me comes down to if I'm getting too high on a player within a position group or wherever, I start asking myself, well, why am I that high in that person? I'll start talking to other people and kind of temperature checking to see what am I missing here or something like that. And even then, if I still feel like, hey, I feel pretty strongly about where I stand on this player, I then start asking myself, okay, well, can I take that player maybe a round later? And so I think there's different strategies within drafts to figure out how you keep that balanced perspective. But what I will say, what I'm not doing is like in a draft thinking, oh, I don't have this much of the exposure, so I need to get them here. It's more of an overarching, okay, learning from my previous drafts to improve my strategy going forward. And then as I improve strategy, it'll allow me to pull on levers that'll probably give me a more balanced portfolio in general.
Yeah, I guess I didn't explain that well. What I'm saying is, let's say I take 2 really good running backs that I know I can count on. And now it's the 10th round and I'm staring at, for as a 3rd running back, Madison or Spiller, let's say, right? And I think Spiller is going to have a floor, and I don't know that Madison will. Like you said, the coaching staff has changed, so it's possible he has a little bit of a sneaky floor. Well, I'm much more likely to take Madison if I have 2 running backs that I know I can count on. I had a 1st and 2nd round running back. If that team's going to win, it's because those running backs do well. So I'm much more likely to take a Madison who has a ceiling than someone who at the same point who has a floor. That's what I more meant by weighted position groups.
Right. So I'd go the opposite. If I have 2 running backs that I believe have high upside and are going to be counting my running back positions, then it's not as important that I hit later on a running back that has substantial upside. Because let's say I go for, 4 running backs and my other ones are Madison, and let's use Spiller as an example where we think of Spiller as not much weekly value, but if Eckler gets hurt, then he becomes the RB1. And so both of those situations, like, all right, in the best case scenario here, I have 4 running backs and I'm not even getting all their scores. In the worst case scenario, I have those 2 running backs and I've got 2 zeros here. Now, where I'd more likely take the guys like a Madison who has the high upside is when I'm going with a 0 RB build and I'm going to draft around 6 running backs. Because in this scenario, I don't have that elite guy on my team. I need Madison to be that elite guy. And so that's where I'm focusing on the ones that, hey, if they don't hit and they give me zeros, this team wasn't going to do well anyways. It's fine. But now when they do hit, I'm picking up in a marginal value so much more than in that previous team. Because now my other running backs are only putting up 10, 12. Madison's giving me 25. I'm gaining substantially more points and hitting my higher outcome. That's where I try to kind of think of which running back fits which roster construction based off who I've already drafted.
But you do it, right? Yes. How you do it is
100%.
It can change from player to player. By the way, 100%. I agree. 0 running back. I definitely love a guy like Madison.
Right.
But the fact is, to me, that's what I call advanced roster construction. It's not just that I took 4 or that I took 5, but I took a lot of thought of exactly what's in the 4 and what's in the 5. That was more the point I was making.
100% agree. And let's use Hopkins as another example where when am I most likely to draft DeAndre Hopkins? So first off,
tell me, because other than when I have Kyler, I don't know.
All right, so I've been going back and forth on this, and I think I feel pretty strongly
because you're not getting that great of a discount.
Pick 80 versus like if he was fully healthy, he'd be what? Like he'd be being drafted around like T. Higgins. He'd probably be like a late second.
Yeah. All right. But 6 games is
it's a lot. But these are also tournaments. We're talking predominantly underdog drafting style
where trying to hit
it's about the playoffs, right? So for me with Hopkins, I'm more likely to draft him similar with this Madison scenario where I'm going with I don't want to call it a 0 wide receiver build because I rarely do that, but just a wide receiver build where I'm probably not going to have many elite talent up top and I'm going to have probably 9 wide receivers or so. Because in this scenario, one, I've got a lot of talent that's going to give me the quality, the depth. So when he's gone, I can make up for it. But 2, when it comes playoff time, I'm looking for the elite guys. And again, if I already started my draft with Stephon Diggs and Jalen Waddle and maybe one other, pretty high guy or something, well, now the value to having an elite season, an elite weeks from DeAndre Hopkins in the playoffs isn't as important because I've already got those guys who are also giving me great points. But when I'm not devoting capital up top and now I'm hoping to hit later on with these wide receivers who are going to provide me with high potential in the playoffs, that's where it's most important for me to get a Hopkins.
Yeah, and my biggest problem with Hopkins, besides the 6 games, is he goes right around where Michael Thomas goes, who I feel like has a better chance, just as much upside, if not more. And, there's a chance you get 16 games out of him. So when I'm looking at that kind of team, I've been pushing Thomas over Hopkins, but I'm glad you clarified that because, as you mentioned, sometimes when you like a guy too much, but also sometimes when you're not sure about a guy, you end up not drafting him when you really need to, run it through with someone smart so that you can, you don't want to not draft someone because you're just not sure.
Right. And so I just looked, I'm at 15% Hopkins, 11% Thomas, like them both. I think for me, and I don't have the right answer in this, but when I think of my weighting of the two is I know that Hopkins is time boxed to 6 games missing. And when he comes back, he's going to be healthy and he's going to be full on clicking in a strong offense. With Michael Thomas, the upside is he doesn't miss any games or only misses a couple games. But the risk is also he's never fully healthy. The offense isn't that good. He doesn't have the same role. And that's where I think I'm more okay saying, hey, those first 6 weeks are not as important to me for Hopkins because I'm playing for the playoffs and I want him to be in that high-powered offense and a great role. I think that's where I give Hopkins a little. But again, I don't know. Could be very wrong, but that's at least the process.
We were talking about fragility, right, as a way to be different. One way that I tend to be different is I like taking 2 quarterbacks between, say, the 6th quarterback and Justin Fields, right, and stopping. Where I, last year I noticed I had a few Brady, Stafford teams, and I find that second tier where you're getting guys who in other years would be considered in the top 5, 2 guys in that window that I'm really high on this year are Dak and Russell Wilson, right? I can see those guys having QB 1, 2, or 3 years, right? Reasonably, you can see both of them being in the top 3. I like stacking them together when I'm spending 7th and 8th round. Now I know it's a 2 QB build. I know I've got 2 guys, high-powered offenses, all the other things you've talked about. And you don't see too many people do it. That's one way that I kind of try and be different, but within the framework of good structure overall. Your thoughts on the way I'm doing it, and do you have any way that you do it?
So I agree with that. I'm not sure whether Fields and Tua are included in that bucket for me.
Fields is, Tua isn't for me.
Yeah, but like I think it's right about there. And then
and Cousins isn't, and maybe he could be for you.
So Cousins and Carr are for me because
Carr is Cousins borderline.
Yeah,
it depends on who the first guy is.
That's fair. But for me, I'm only drafting Cousins or Carr or Rodgers if I have heavy in their stack partners early on.
Correct.
And so they're not getting points on the ground. So if they're going to have a great season, if they're going to have a great playoff weeks, it's also going to come in partnership with pass catchers on their team. So that's why I am okay with taking them, because I've already drafted one or two of their pass catchers early on. But back to your original point, I think that makes complete sense. My most common strategy is I will draft in that around the 5, 6, 6th round, Lamar, Kyler, or Hurts. If I draft one of those, I'm fine waiting until basically as late as it ends up going, because I'm hoping that one of those has that top 3 season. That next tier that you talked about with the Burrow, the Russ, the Dak, the Brady, the Trey Lance, and so forth. When I draft one of those, I'm honestly trying to grab a second one that's probably even a little higher than Fields, but I'm okay if I do end up with Fields as those being my 2.
Fields is a guy for me that's kind of skips a few rungs, because I love him as a number 2. Because he's easy to stack and he's easy to correlate week 17. I think it's a sneaky game, 17. Did you saw this?
Yeah, and so Stogie's leaving some information out. I think I got him about 2.5 rounds of value. But yes, you are right. Okay. I think I got him with pick like 140.
Well, and that's another factor, right, that you have to consider. But Fields to me is, it's those Konami guys, right? They always have a 40-point week in them, right? And if he's my second quarterback and I've got someone good, I feel like I know he's going to have a bunch of meh games where he throws for 185 and runs for 50, and it's really not a great score. But I just feel like, again, you got a new offense. I think him and Mooney have something special. You can get Mooney really pretty cheaply, I think.
We're drafting Justin Fields at his floor, basically, scenario where that offense is just atrocious. And I think that offense is going to be atrocious, but I'm okay drafting Fields because if that offense is even just average, Justin Fields can very easily become a fantasy weapon because of the way he plays the game.
And I also like drafting quarterbacks whose team have a bad defense. Right. Yeah. Because, end of the game, we all know what the end of the game point, Blake Bortles
garbage time.
Yeah. So, all right. Let's talk about correlations. Another Twitter argument is, well, now that everyone knows about correlations, there's less value in correlating. I disagree with that. What's your thought?
It's not that hard if someone really wants to do this. I'm not the one that's getting in these arguments, so I'm not taking the time to do it. But this is easily solvable because you have one group that's saying everyone's doing this or enough people are doing it that it's not worth it anymore. And another group is saying, no, we're in a bubble. There aren't that many people actually doing it. But literally no one from either bucket has just gone and looked at their drafts. Like if you have 50 drafts, that's 50 times 12. You're looking at 600 teams. You can tell me of those 600 teams, how much they actually correlated and stuff, because that'll actually tell us like, hey, are we actually doing this? Are a lot of people doing this, or is it just our bubble? And so unless someone's actually going to go through and figure out what that data is and say, then I don't know. I think it's a pretty silly argument because
I've done some of exactly what you said and gone through, and it's not insignificant, but what you don't see is the consistency. Right. So my whole strategy this year is being willing to give up. I had a 30% pass through rate last year, got no teams into the finals. I didn't make money. And I had a very, very successful week 15. I was like double what the expected was. but I got completely wiped out in the semis. All right, on Underdog. So I've always been a great value drafter. I'm willing to give up some of my value to make sure that I have a plan for that each team. I don't know which team is going to get there, and I don't care about week 15 because it's a 1 in 10 shot. And a lot of times there's a lot of broken teams that make it into the playoffs, right? They advance, but they really, you're really playing against 6 or 7 teams in week 15. So I don't worry about that. But I don't find, I think week 17, you're finding a lot more correlations, but mostly with the quarterbacks. And you're not seeing as many secondary correlations like I talked about the Jets and Seattle. You can pick up Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. Both are cheap. And you can pick up Elijah Moore, Garrett Will. I mean, there's so many ways. Michael Carter. And that's a secondary correlation. There's a chance if that game might not blow up week 17, but there certainly could be 2 30-point games in that game.
Right. No one thought Detroit-Seattle was going to blow up, but it turns out ASB and Penny absolutely did in week 17 last year.
Correct. Yeah. And so I'm trying to do more of that. And I don't think that so I want every one of my teams to have a week 16 plan and a week 17 plan, right? With more focus on week 17, obviously, because instead of a 1 in 18 shot, it's 400 and whatever people aiming for the top. But that's my thoughts on it.
I'm not going to say you're wrong. Obviously, there is value to having, if I was making a DFS lineup in week 16 and I'm in a field of me and 17 others, I'm highly considering doing some form of a game stack. I probably at least have a run back. And if that's how I would draft that day, then yes, it makes sense that, hey, if you're able to project what you're going to have in week 16, maybe you add it if it doesn't cost you anything at all. But
that's the key point.
I will say,
how much are you giving up to get it?
The EV, the expected value for optimizing for week 16 versus the expected value for optimizing for week 17. This is hard to really kind of understand, but it's just because the prize pool is so heavily geared towards that 17 and just making it to week 17 doesn't get you that much. It is literally 100x more value for that week 17. I'm far more just focusing on the week 17 and, there's a focus on getting to the playoffs and advancing, and there's week 17. And my first strategy of focusing on getting to the playoffs, I think that covers me 9 out of 10 of the way there for that week 16, because I'm still getting correlation. I'm probably just not focusing on the game stacks aspect, but to beat out 17, it's not so much that you need the perfect game stack. You really just need to get lucky with the right players, because in that situation, all it takes is 1 or 2 players to go off, have that 40, 45, 49-point Gabriel Davis week or whatever, and that's what's going to advance you. And so rather than try to optimize for that scenario of the 1 out of 18, give me where I need to beat out 469 others, because that's where you really do need to be perfect.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that at all. And, I think you can do both, right? I think obviously week 17 is way more important. But when you're on the clock, I always have talked about tiebreakers, right? Well, to me, the first tiebreaker is a stack, right? Is it worth adding to your stack, right? Then obviously next is week 17. But if you don't have, if the first 13, 14 guys on the board, the rest of that tier don't have that, and there's a guy down 7 that has a week 16 correlation, yeah, I'm going to take I'm going to give up a little bit of value, maybe take someone 4 or 5 picks earlier than his ADP, 8 picks ahead of his ADP, depending on when in the draft it is, and I'm going to add a week 16 correlation. So I think you can, walk and chew gum when it comes to this stuff, but it does take more effort, especially when is a 30-second clock.
Yep, completely fair.
All right. How do you balance getting your needed stacks and correlations versus value? I know. So I already talked about that a little bit, but how, what are your, I mean, how much, like the example, Carr was 2 rounds late and, um, and you didn't have a stack. What if there was someone right near him who you would have had to have reached 5 to 7 picks, but you did have a stack? I mean, how do you balance that?
Yeah. I mean, as the draft goes on, the later in the draft it goes, the more I'm willing to reach for a stack partner. But in general, I'm just not willing to reach that much. And the data kind of supports this, that each time you do reach, you're decreasing your overall value. And I think a lot of the times, like the most common thing that we see people reaching for are the quarterbacks. And I think, to be honest, more often than not, this is the worst time to actually be reaching. Because what's the scenario while you're reaching? Okay, you drafted Justin Jefferson, you drafted Adam Thielen. You really want to make sure you get that Kirk Cousins stack because you've invested so heavily in this offense. So Kirk Cousins coming around, you're 6 picks, before ADP, and you're like, okay, I got to take him here. Well, who are you really fighting against in this situation? Because you've already drafted his 2 top pass catchers. Osborne hasn't been drafted yet. Irv Smith hasn't been drafted yet. Yeah, maybe someone stacks him with Dalvin, but because you're already heavily invested in that offense, it's more likely Cousins is actually going to fall back to you. And now you're getting that round of value. And so, no, this isn't just a tried and true, and you've got to do it every time. It's also a question of, all right, if I take a risk on not getting Cousins here, is there another player that is substantially better than who I would take in the next round? Because I know I'm taking Cousins in the next round if he falls to me. So I'm really gaining that 1 round. If at the end of the day, the wide receiver I take here is virtually the same as the wide receiver I take in a round, okay, that's a scenario. Maybe it makes sense. Let me reach a little to get my kind of Cousins pair. But again, it's all about thinking through the game, the game theory aspects of it.
It really does, because a lot of times I'll be on the board and Cousins in this situation is like the 8th or 9th guy down on the list. But when I look at those 8 or 9 guys, there's no one I love, right? I mean, we're talking 10th round, right? 10th, 11th round. Now, if there's a guy there that I think is a tier above Kirk Cousins, yeah, I'm going to take that guy. I'm not going to pass on, a great value to make a stack, but I will drop half a tier to make a stack, because it helps me to take value afterwards, right? Once you get your main stack, then you can just scoop value.
Yeah, and obviously it depends where that half round is.
Correct.
There's also an interesting aspect.
and who makes it up,
right? And there's another interesting aspect where, I have been drafting basically no Michael Pittman. And the reason why is because whereas ADP is, I don't know, I think there are always better options to draft instead of him. Where I have slowly taken some outliers is when I draft Jonathan Taylor at number 1 overall. Then in the second, I'm going to get maybe Leonard Fournette, maybe T. Higgins. I don't know. I'm now in that weird scenario, okay to reach on Michael Pittman, because I'm reaching on ADP in a scenario where it's giving me the correlation and the uniqueness aspect there. Because Michael Pittman's his ADP, I don't expect it to ever go any higher. So it's rare that anyone is going to be drafting. Many people are going to be drafting him at the same place that they're getting Jonathan Taylor. So I'm getting a little bit uniqueness there. I'm getting some team correlation, even though I'm accepting that I'm taking a player that I think is a tier below who the next area is.
He was one of my most owned guys when he was in the 4th, 5th round early. And the only time I was drafting a lot of him, when Barkley was if I could go Jonathan Taylor or even a guy, let's say CMC, and then Barkley was there. I was taking a lot of Barkley when he was at the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd. So yeah, I would correlate Pittman with Barkley for week 17. And I knew that would open up, Matt Ryan or Daniel Jones as my second quarterback. And again, it depended on who am I passing to get there. I find that, that pick 24 to pick 30 to be a real tough area of the draft.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, that's probably something I missed out on because you can't get Barkley there anymore. But I wonder how many JT, Barkley, Pittman starts there are just going full week 17, getting that correlation, getting all three there. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yep.
See Eagles in chat asking about a draft. I don't know. I think we've been on for an hour. I think we'll probably be wrapping up soon. But it's Friday.
I got 2 or 3 more questions. This was always meant to be a conversation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Justin does 2 to 3, 2 drafts a week, and that doesn't include if he's a guest somewhere else. I wanted this to be more of a deep dive into some advanced strategies. Yeah, I think that I said I'm of the belief that DFS projections are much more, the kind of projections you get in DFS. I hear people talk about, well, that's the next evolution of Bestball. I find that to be much harder to pull off. Even the really good DFS guys tell you their projections aren't really worth shit until, the 4th, 5th week of a season when you really know the roles and you really I do think there's value in projecting, but I don't see Bestball turning into a pure numbers game like DFS is. Am I crazy?
Well, I think the challenge with projections across an entire season are obviously they're wildly inaccurate, but even if you assume a level of accuracy, how do you project a player like, let's say, Tyrion Davis-Price? Because from an actual projections, like you're trying to create his, what he's going to do for the season. All right, you take a look at his range of outcomes. You take a look at what his base is going to be. You add in some form of an upside scenario. But at the end of the day, you're still going to come out to, okay, here's how many yards, here's how many touchdowns, here's how many catches and stuff. And it's likely just going to be a weighted average that puts him somewhere. Oh, he's going to be the backup running back with maybe some upside. Okay. In Bestball, if you're drafting Tyrion Davis-Price, you don't care at all about the scenario where he's only going to get 20 to 30% of the touches. You're playing for the 10% outcome where he actually becomes the starter. He actually becomes the workhorse. He actually becomes whatever that high upside scenario is. And so that's where it's hard to ETR does some amazing projections, but it's very difficult to even then take those season-long projections and build them into a Bestball model because we're caring about not the expectation, but we're caring about that really extreme upside scenario. And so I think that's where I don't want to say take projections with a grain of salt because it's not even that. It's each player you should be thinking about why are you drafting or why you're not drafting this player. And when I make up my personal rankings, that's what I'm really basing it off. I start with a level of projections, but then I'm merely customizing them specifically for a Bestball drafting tournament lens.
Yeah. And when you draft a player in a season-long contest, like Tyrion Davis-Price, let's say you get 15% of him. Well, again, that's let's say you think he has a 15% chance of being the starter at some point. Right? So you're going to take 15% Tyrion Davis-Price. Your leverage is the 85% of the lineups that you don't have him. And also the fact that you can win because he's such a late round pick with him doing nothing. Right? So I agree. And I do think that kind of something I've tried to do a lot more of is, when I take a player, you have to build the team as if, especially early, that guy's going to be successful, right? You don't want to handcuff out of fear. Like when you talked about handcuffing, most people who handcuffed in the old days did it out of fear, right? Fear of injury. That's not what you're talking about here. You're talking about a scenario where they both could be needed on the same team.
100%. And when we think of projections, you're thinking of them for your home leagues. And when you only have to beat out 11 people, and that's literally what your goal is, and that defines success, maybe some players that are, I don't know, I still think Tyrion Davis-Price is a great play, but maybe some of those just you feel, hey, this isn't worth the risk because too often this is a zero. And as you said, DFS, when I'm right, what do I win? When you're right, you only beat 11 people. And like, you don't need that really high outside. In these other scenarios, when I'm right, I need to be able to beat 470 people in week 17.
Yep, I agree completely. All right, let's finish up with just a little player. Oh, one other thing I did want to hit on. How much, again, DFS, you go into most weeks factoring that your guys are going to be healthy, right? They're healthy entering, and you can't plan if they're going to get hurt. Season long, we know players are going to get hurt, and a lot of them. How much does injuries and the threat of injury come into your strategy, and how does it come in?
I would say that the threat of an injury doesn't really come much into my strategy for drafting that player. Accepting that injuries will happen plays a major strategy in who I am drafting for the corollary players on those offenses. Whether it is, as we talk about, the actual running back situation with the backup, whether it is the wide receiver who's going to find himself more volume, or whether it is someone that the entire offense shifts with one injury. Like Derrick Henry is a great example, where if you're not drafting Derrick Henry, if Derrick Henry ends up getting hurt and you want to draft Hassan Haskins, okay, great. But in that scenario that you're right, that Hassan Haskins has a major role because Henry got hurt, what else is happening on that team? They're probably also becoming a lot more of a pass-heavy team. So maybe you should also draft Ryan Tannehill. Maybe you should also bring in either it's an Austin Hooper or a Treylon Burks or a Robert Woods or whatever it is. But now think of one injury and what are the ripple effects?
Yep. And I mean, for me, it has to do with my risk willingness with exposure, especially in the first two rounds. I don't see the need to go more than 15% on anybody. And it's rare this year that I'm going to be less than 4 or 5% on anyone, right? I find that because nothing will kill you more than an injury, right? So I don't want to have 40% of a guy in the first, second round, because even if they have, even if I'm right, and I guess right, and that's the guy, the win rate really, I don't know. I found from studying that like a guy like Taylor last year, he had like a 47% advance rate. My teams might have been 48% or 50%, but I had 21% Debo and I won 62. I advanced in 62% of my Debo lineups, right? And that was consistent pretty much throughout. So I'm not trying to win or lose drafts. I mean, I think 15% is a really significant position on a guy that early, right? It's not like I'm not willing to make a bet. It's just I'm trying to. I feel like I have an advantage from all the things we've talked about. That I need to make less mistakes up front because I have such an advantage overall with my team building. Does that make sense too?
That makes complete sense. And earlier this week, Brick and Overzet put out a Laws episode where they talked specifically about Bestball and taking some of the GTO poker as well as like the DFS 150 maxing strategy. And one of those conversations was, well, at some point, you should just accept that, like, hey, your exposure should be close to 8% for every player, unless you're willing to take a stand positively or negatively on that player. Because if you don't have a reason for why you are stronger or less on that player, you should default to just saying, I'm going to get 8% because that's what is just purely average. And I think that's a bit more of an extreme way that I'm looking at. Because I think just inherently, and maybe it is a flaw, like I do have takes, but I think it is important just to kind of keep that mindset for, hey, why am I so high on this player? Why am I off this player?
Gotcha. All right. Speaking of players, you put out this will be the last question. As you mentioned, we've been going quite a while, and I appreciate you sticking with me. You put out a tweet with a few players that you're on more than the field. Who were those players? Because I think there was one I agreed with and a couple I wanted to question you on.
All right. Testing my memory here. I believe Tyler Higbee was one of them. We chatted about him.
And I like him.
I believe Trey Lance was one of them. And a lot of that was, and yeah, a lot of that was just the way that he plays, expecting him to be a starter, all of that. I believe Traylon Burks was one of them. For me, I think
And his ADP has dropped, and now I'm drafting him where I had a hard time drafting him, when he was going in the 7th, but now you can get him in the 8th, 9th.
I mean, and on DraftKings, his ADP is like 115 or something. It's pretty crazy. Yeah.
I don't do DK.
Okay.
Unlike you, I like to stick to 2 sites. I'm FFPC and Underdog, and I don't like mixing up Superflex and doing a lot of the other. I just feel that it at my age, it makes me a little too thin.
I hear you. I was trying to look to see who some of the other players were on that list. Rashad White, I'm very high on.
That's one I wanted to ask you on.
Okay.
And I guess that's simple because of the offense he plays on. My thought has been on him. If Fournette goes down, it's going to be a committee. They're just not going to give. And I didn't like Rashad White's tape as much as others, and people could laugh at that. But I've been pretty good with running backs. But you really think he could be the guy?
I don't know, but I'm okay with. But what I do know is that the running back in that offense is a very valuable role. Even in the playoffs last year when Leonard Fournette went down, the combination of what Rojo and Keyshawn Vaughn ended up putting up together like 50 points. Like, it was insane. And I think it just shows that, it's a 1-game sample size, but just in general, it shows it doesn't matter who is in this offense, that there's going to be a lot of points. And when I think, can Rashad White be a workhorse? Well, the things we really care about is, hey, can he work in pass protection and can he catch passes? Pass protection, I think so. I don't know. Reading reports and stuff, like, there's no one that's like calls that out as a kind of glaring hole. But we know that he definitely has the pass catching chops. So now we're in a scenario where if he does get that pass catching role, he has actual weekly value. And if something happens to Fournette, he continues to go to Golden Corral, he gets hurt, whatever it is, then you now have the opportunity for Rashad White to really take on a major role in an extremely valuable spot.
Yeah.
Like here, I'll ask you real quick. All right, just throw it out there. But if we found out that Leonard Fournette was cut because of the weight, because maybe he had an injury, whatever it is, I believe that Rashad White would instantly be a 4th rounder.
I was going to say late 3rd round.
Yeah.
I think the hype, people love their rookies. I would say he would definitely go ahead of Breece Hall. I think he would slot in right after Connor. Okay. Right in that range.
I think it's fair. Yeah. And like, knowing that, and then the possibility that he actually may have some weekly value as a pass catching back, like, yeah, give me that in the 13th round.
Well, and we started this, and I don't remember if it was on air, or it might have been pre-show, by my saying I podcast to get better. And my biggest takeaway of my own weakness throughout this whole podcast is your relentless chasing of upside through the best offenses. And I think that's a hole, because there's no reason I shouldn't at least be 8% on Rashad White. And I can guarantee you I'm not there. So I've got a few things to tweak to try and get better. I appreciate you coming on and having this kind of discussion with me and sharing your thoughts. Anything else that you want to pitch or talk about before we get out of here?
I appreciate you bringing me on. I always enjoyed these conversations. You always, through your questions, kind of get me thinking about things that I haven't maybe fully thought through or articulated them. And I always feel the best way for me to, even improve, get more concrete in my thinking is through educating others, and kind of that's through these discussions. So appreciate you bringing me on. This has been fantastic. No, honestly, hey, things are great. I'd say for people who do love Bestball, keep an eye on my Twitter account, because in about less than 2 weeks, we're going to be launching a new Bestball product that is more pack space, where instead of doing a draft, you open a pack, you get cards, you choose a lineup, and that becomes your entry for the season. It's a nice, fun spin on Bestball that we're going to be launching.
Well, and you did. I remember we had talked. You were affiliated or part owner of a company that was in the NFT space. So
Yeah.
it's similar. That's kind of what you're talking about.
It's part of the umbrella, yeah. So it's called the Owners Club, and it's NFT fantasy football. And we're starting off with Bestball for this summer. So it'll start first week of August. And yeah, it's a really cool experience. It's very fun. At $10 for a pack, and in that pack are your cards. You then select which one of those you want to be your best ball lineup for the season, and that becomes your entry for the season.
I think that is a tremendous idea. I'm not a big NFT guy. If zero could be considered not a big,
you don't need to be.
But what's that?
And you don't need to be. All the blockchain behind the scenes, the NFT, it's a fun experience.
But that sounds incredibly fun, incredibly intriguing. Keep your eye out on Justin's Twitter account for that. Justin, thanks again. We will see you guys soon. I think I have one other pod this weekend, and I'm definitely going to try and fit in. I just signed up for Spike Week, and I'm enjoying their overlay. And I will do a live draft this week using the overlay, show you how exactly I do it. And I hope you guys will check that out. Thanks a lot, Justin. We'll talk to everyone soon.